Donald Trump has signed an executive order which effectively dismantles 7 federal agencies, which are costing the U.S. taxpayers over $1.6 billion a year. And naturally, the left is outraged. This is an article from The Hill, which is discussing this issue. This is written by Alex Gangitano, or whatever. And it's titled, Trump Signs Order to Dismantle 7 Federal Agencies Focused on Media, Libraries, and Homelessness. Uh-oh. President Trump on Friday signed an executive order that aims to eliminate 7 federal agencies, including ones that focus on media, libraries, museums, and ending homelessness. The president directed the government entities to, quote, be eliminated to the maximum extent consistent with applicable law, insisting that they reduce the performance of the statutory functions and associated personnel. It ordered the heads of each entity to submit a report to the Office of Management and Budget confirming full compliance within just 7 days. The president targeted the U.S. Agency of Global Media, which is the parent company of Voice of America's, or VOA, as well as the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in the Smithsonian Institution, which is a think tank, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is an agency that supports libraries, archives, and museums in every state. The Hill goes on to write that the Trump administration has been focused on an overhaul of the federal government, with tech billionaire Elon Musk tasked with finding ways to cut spending and workers. That work has been met with challenges in the courts. Federal judges in both Maryland and Northern California District Court issued orders Thursday halting the mass dismissals, which will get overturned eventually, but it's corrupt courts doing their thing. And the White House, of course, on Friday vowed to appeal the federal court's ruling, which has required the Trump administration to reinstate probationary government employees. So, let's take a closer look at these 7 agencies and why is Donald Trump dismantling them? So let's start with the big one, the USAGM. This is costing the U.S. taxpayers $950 million a year. The USAGM is a so-called independent federal agency which oversees U.S. government-funded international broadcasting. Its supposed mission, which was rooted in the U.S. International Broadcasting Act of 1994, is to inform, engage, and connect to people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. My, those are flowery words, and don't they sound nice? Now, this agency manages 5 networks: Voice of America, or the VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. Boy, oh boy. Now, these outlets broadcast in 63 languages, and they claim that they reach about 427 million people weekly across 100 countries. But is this claim true? And is this investment really worth it? Well, when we take a look closer at this, we find that the audience numbers that supposedly exist are self-reported and almost impossible to verify independently. So this 427 million weekly is suspect at best. This seems like a boondoggle written all over it. This is the federal government, after all. I mean, are we even swaying anyone from these countries to suddenly decide that, hey, democracy, that's it for me? Are we reaching people? I bet you'd be hard-pressed to find any real tangible evidence of this. Worse still, back in 2021, the GAO reportedly flagged weak oversight of its grantees. Surprise, surprise. And at the time, there were millions of dollars being wasted on internal probes. And if that wasn't enough, this propaganda agency has also been accused of left-wing bias, of being a left-wing propaganda rag. For example, the Voice of America, their English language content has long covered U.S. social issues, accusing the U.S. of racial inequality, pushing out climate change propaganda. They were pro-illegal immigration, and so much more. The VOA even did puff pieces for the hate group Black Lives Matter and their protests, trying to justify their hate, their racism, and violence by making claims that the U.S. was systemic in its racism. They gave airtime to these BLM hate group activists while giving much less airtime to law and order counterparts. Similarly, climate stories often leaned on IPCC reports or the Greta Thunberg-type voices, rarely giving skeptics airtime. The bottom line is, this agency is not a friend of the U.S., at least not the U.S. that this country was founded as. It has become more of a propaganda piece, an arm for the growing socialist-leaning left within our country. It's a tool that has been used to blast our own country as racist and bad. Which then brings us back to the question, of why are we paying for this garbage? And it appears that Donald Trump was thinking the same thing, and so it's getting the axe. Next up, let's look at the Minority Business Development Agency, another one of the agencies that Trump has gotten rid of here. They receive $12 million a year in funding. Now, this is the year 2025, my friends, not 1960. Why are we putting up with federal agencies basing their funding on racial lines? Race should have no basis ever for any federal assistance. Not ever. It's time to end this ridiculous nonsense that continually and perpetually divides the country with racial division and hate. We should all be Americans, not Black Americans, not white Americans, not Asian Americans, just Americans. This kind of BS does not belong in this country, and I'm sick and tired of federal dollars by our federal government playing a role in continuing to divide Americans in our country. It's tired, it's played out, and it needs to stop. And surprise, surprise, the Trump administration is seeing this program for what it really is. It's just another DEI program. And so Trump is giving it the axe. And of course, Democrats and those who obsess over race argue that this is a necessary program because it levels the playing field for so-called historically disadvantaged groups. But that's just the bigotry of low expectations. The idea that you are a lesser than. You are someone who can't succeed because you happen to be born to a race that just can't rise to the top. It's all utter nonsense. It's BS. But it is the kind of propaganda that the left has been using for the better part of a century to divide Americans. Then there is the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, or the CDFI, which receives $330 million a year in funding. The CDFI officially aims to expand economic opportunity in underserved communities, often low-income or rural areas, by supporting financial institutions like credit unions and loan funds. Now, this program isn't explicitly race-based, as their mission is to focus on underserved, but in the era of DEI, that almost always seems to turn into some racial nonsense. The CDFI is just taxpayer money being put into a centralized program, which almost surely is going to be full of waste and bloat. It would be much better to get the DC bureaucracy out of all of this and give it back to the states. If it's not a core federal duty, why in the world are we paying for this? Critics, though, would argue that the lack of resources or the will to fill the gap, like homelessness funding, for instances, often leans on federal dollars, rather than the states fixing their own problems. Then we have the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. Speaking of homelessness, they have a budget of $4 million a year. Now, I have to ask, why on earth do we need another agency to fight our so-called war on poverty? We already have this giant program where we have spent trillions of dollars to end poverty ever since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society kickoff back in 1960, and yet nothing ever seems to change. We only have greater and greater problems. The federal government, my friends, is run by a bunch of feckless, useless idiots, especially when it comes to solving our poverty issue. They don't know what they're doing, and it's time to stop giving them the money to do this. It is time to return this war on poverty back to the states and let them hash it out individually. Stealing endlessly from the American people at large to fix this problem has done nothing but run up the national debt. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't help anybody. It's just a waste of money. And worse, it's propping up government unions who have agendas of their own. And so on and on it goes with these programs. They're all wasteful, top-down command and control federal government spending, which we don't need to be doing. We don't need to be giving money to these agencies anymore. The bottom line to all of this, my friends, is this. I'm going to use the term systemic for once in a way that actually makes sense. These programs are but a microcosm, a small slice of a massive federal pie that embodies the endless gluttony and greed of a federal government that knows no bounds. It is a systemic waste that is strangling the American citizen with endless calls for more taxes, like that of the doofus Bernie Sanders, who never stops his cries to tax more millionaires and billionaires as if we need more taxes. We don't need more taxes. We need less spending. The reality is, my friends, if we kicked the federal government out of most of its systemic spending habits, we wouldn't need all this taxpayer money going to waste. We wouldn't need to tax so many people. We could lower the tax rates for all. And the reality is, my friends, if we take it a step further, we aren't really even spending American taxpayer dollars anymore. Our debt is so huge, so overwhelming, that we are just simply borrowing ourselves into oblivion. Taxpayers be damned. Our massive $37 trillion debt is a symbol of a government that is so big, so bloated, and so wasteful that it now threatens to consume the entire country because of its gluttony. Now, I'm sure that there will be some who will defend these programs as it's just chump change. It's just $1.6 billion compared to our massive federal yearly budget. But to that I say, why should we not cut it out if it really is chump change? Our massive, overwhelming debt is made up in large part from a million of these little chump change expenses. It all goes back to that systemic waste, that systemic greed that our federal government has. Our debt is so massive now that it is opening the door to cause our entire country to implode if we don't get a handle on this. All it would take would be rates to spike or our growth to grind to a halt, and we would be in massive economic trouble right now. This isn't really even about just the $1.6 billion in these 7 agencies that we waste, or even the fact that they're anti-American. I mean, those are all problematic, don't get me wrong. But you have 37 trillion reasons why we need to put a stop to this crap. The federal government has become so big now, my friends, that it spends almost 2% of our country's GDP on their administration alone. So, no matter how much you hear these whiny, sniveling little government lover types complain that, oh, the government, we need to protect the workers, this is a good thing. We need a lot more of these kinds of actions and cuts to happen. These agencies need to be dismantled as fast as possible because our very country's existence is at stake.